afternoon. We're going to get started.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Lalinda. I'm the program manager for WILD. I'm going to share a little bit of background information on the program and a little bit about our panelists before we get started. So our program today will provide a legal and social analysis of incarcerated labor. And next slide, please, Sophia. I wanted just to provide a little bit of background information on the organizations hosting this program today. I work with WILD, the Wanton Injustice Legal Detail. Our vision is to create a Twin Cities communities free of anti-Black racism and all forms of racism. We do this by providing a platform through which our attorneys can support existing community-based organizations doing this work. So essentially, I organize pro bono legal services for racial equity initiatives. Next slide, please. Our partners in this program are the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. IWOC is a union for the incarcerated fighting for prison abolition. IWOC works to better conditions and end mass incarceration and prison slavery and to reimagine a system that keeps people out of the systems in the first place. Next slide, please. And our third partner in this is the End Slavery in Minnesota Coalition. They're a solidarity network of businesses, nonprofit, and organizations throughout the state committed to ending prison slavery in Minnesota. And before we get started, I'm going to introduce our panel. Next slide, please. Today with us, we have Felicia Smith, CEO of That Exclusive, Zeke Caligiuri, the co-founder of the Reinfranchise Coalition and a part of the Minnesota Justice Research Center. And then we have Tim Loris, the co-founder and shareholder of Loris Marshall O'Brien PA. And then our moderator today is Chantel Allen here, an organizer with End Slavery in Minnesota. I'm going to invite Zeke up. He's going to provide us a little bit of background information on our current prison system.
Welcome, everyone. All right. My name is Zeke Caligiuri. Those of you who don't know me, I'm a recent homecomer after spending over 2 decades incarcerated here in the state of Minnesota. I currently work with other newly reenfranchised human beings coming home from prison to organize around the empowerment of their lives as they come home, advocate for those who are still incarcerated. Very heavy duty. I am part of a community of people whose lives were transformed through the shaping of personal language, both in a written form and spoken form. It created an understanding for me about the way language can be used to control other people. From start to finish, incarceration, at its most simplest, is the total domination of a human life. The physical captivity that we understand, being locked into individual units, we understand that as a cell. But also, there is the dominance that adversely affects persons' health risks. It is dominance over your financial life. It is a systematic disconnection from your family and community that extends into financial exploitation of all your interactions with family and the world, a continual purging of the elements of these human beings' lives. It's a political disconnect as well, as you aren't even, as an incarcerated person, a viable enough human to cast a vote in the election. But you are still a unit whose name and actions can be publicly manipulated in advance or to discredit a campaign. The system we now have didn't grow into what it is by accident. It was engineered. It was a system that was engineered by real people who noticed the financial advantages to a system of control that keeps its captives dependent upon it for its sustenance and a menial wage, and ties individuals' working statuses to their access to recreation time and abilities to communicate with their families. We think about the language in the 13th Amendment. What brings us here in the United States Constitution, as well as the Minnesota Constitution, to say otherwise, that slavery is banned otherwise than as a punishment for a crime. The existence of this small snippet of language is what created the legal space for what we understand mass incarceration to be. It exists because of this one particular provision. Those few words are the seeds to the entire prison industrial complex that we understand. So yes, those words matter. That small bit of language matters. What it made possible, it took away the personal agency of an individual's own labor. It empowered the exponential growth of the law enforcement apparatus in the country, as well as right here. It is the first bit of language that grew to an unceasing construction of policies and statutes that exist today and that we understand incarceration to be. It's provided cheap exploitive labor at the bottom of the prison industrial complex. In Minnesota, the wage scale for the incarcerated starts at 25 cents an hour and gradually goes up in 25-cent increments every 90 days, up to $1, depending on the kind of labor, up to $1.50 or $2 an hour. In instances where restitution is owed, half of these wages are taken. There are other court-ordered and institution-sanctioned penalties that justify the same garnishing of wages. Human beings will start their incarceration, no matter of personal skill level, at 12 cents an hour. It takes 9 months just to get to that $1 an hour slot. Some people will spend their whole incarceration paying off restitution that they owe. It took me over 20 years to pay off the fines and restitution that I had set for me by the courts. And we're not speaking to precarity and vulnerability that places individuals who have to depend on these wages to supplement insufficient meals, stay in contact with family through what was an exploitive phone system, or to pay postage. It is the same wage scale that was implemented in 1998. So as inflation has done what it has done in the most recent years and throughout the last 25 years, the wage scale inside of prison has stayed exactly the same. These jobs are used for control. They're weaponized to make human beings more dependent on the money they make. And in such a scarce economy, it pits individuals against each other into direct competition over the paltry scraps given to us by the institution. We are dependent on a single centralized canteen to supplement the continually declining food quality being served, and to a point where it has become an unchallenged monopoly. The financial control extends to harm families of the incarcerated as well. If human beings in these places are fortunate enough to have people that can help them financially, the system takes 20% of that money coming in and charges them another 10% on the way out. It is nothing more than a fear-based system that ties labor to a set of punitive processes that don't include the input of the incarcerated population at all. There are no protections for these workers. If you lose your job, you are made to wait 60 to 90 days before you're even eligible to apply for another job, in which case you are now made to start over at $1/4 an hour again. So not only are you without a wage for over 3 months and can make it through a gauntlet and restrictive and special housing units, you are now back to the beginning. We certainly all have parts of our being that need to be confronted. Our understanding of the harms we've created in our single lifetimes and ways to make ourselves more capable and ready to live in a complex society. But we can never learn or access these realizations from the same people who think it's okay to exploit and harm the people they hold captive within their system. They have modeled an exploitive structure of treatment towards these human beings, and you expect, and we expect as a society, that these people are going to learn the kinds of practices that will give them the ability to transform themselves. The system has modeled a version of authority that teaches them to manipulate and exploit, and then when they fail to succeed, we blame the person who came out of the mind effery of those places. That was the system you told us would fix people, would make our communities safer, yet none of that was the truth. The state of Minnesota incarcerates 323 people per 100,000, which would equal the combination of Italy, France, and Canada's incarceration rates. And this is within our state that has generally believed itself to be much more progressive, much more caring, and much more people-centric. What we understand about this is that throughout it all, it has been a system that was constructed at the very beginning as a response to Reconstruction, early forms, convict leasing, ideas of the Black codes in the Deep South. What they turned into was mass incarceration through the same sort of pushing of this exact loophole that we are trying to close. Thank you.
Oh, that was pretty thorough. How y'all feeling out there? Good? Good food? All right, that's what's up. So I'm Chantel Allen. I'm the organizer with End Slavery in Minnesota. I'm also on the St. Paul School Board, and I ran a campaign to end the school to prison pipeline. I'm in my second term. And I'm also one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter Twin Cities. And so I've been doing this for a long time. My degree is African American Studies and Psychology, and I study basically the actions and the things that we do as Black people, right? And the history. And so this has been an issue that has really kind of dug at me for a long time, which is this is the foundation of the Black Lives Matter work. And so me as an organizer for Black Lives Matter, I'm like a gerbil in a cage. I'm trying to get these policies changed, but the reality is the foundation is already set there to incarcerate people all the way from Reconstruction, as Zeke said, right? And so until we undo this foundation, which is the Constitution in our state, it's the Constitution in the federal government, that is the foundation of our country. That's the bottom line, right? Until we undo that, a lot of these we might be able to change this law, but they're just gonna find another loophole to get back in it. Because the reality is free labor is profitable. That's the reality. And that's something that folks learned 400, 500, 600 years ago, right? When they started to build this country. And no one ever wanted to let that go. And they still don't want to let it go. And a lot of the things that we're seeing right now, when we look at like the conditions inside the prisons and the wages that they're being paid, it mirrors slavery. It mirrors exactly how slave masters thought and felt about their slave owners. And we can't forget the Dred Scott decision. The fact that if you are a slave, you're only 3/5 of a man. And so until we change this in the Constitution, that will always stand. And we will always have an argument about why our prison systems are so horrid. So I just wanted to put that out there because the next question I have is, who are you and what brings you to this conversation today? And I thought it'd be odd to just throw it out there at all these guys and y'all didn't even know who I was. Right. So I wanted to spit that out there right quick so you can understand me. But I do want you, each one of you, starting with Felicia, how'd you get here? Who are you? And
hello, everybody. My name is Felicia Smith. I'm originally from Ohio. In Christmas Eve of November 2016, I robbed a bank, the first of 4. And I ended up in federal prison. So I was incarcerated from November 18th, 2018, November 14th, 2018, and my sentence only ended February 15th of 2023. So I haven't been home long. And so I spent my time in prison working. I was a slave. I had to work. Whether I felt good, felt bad, sad, happy. I was suicidal and I had to work. 23 cents an hour. Minnesota pays better. They told me that was good in federal prison, 23 cents an hour. And so I did what I had to. I worked. What did I do? I sewed. Straight line, 7 hours a day, 23 cents an hour. I couldn't buy a postage stamp for 1 hour of work. Over, just imagine, over, for years. This, 7 hours a day, 23 cents an hour. It was in prison where I realized that it was wrong. There was a point in time where we were supposed to get a 45-minute break, but they kept cutting it. 5 minutes, 5 more minutes, 5 more minutes. Next thing I know, we're getting like 15 minutes to try and go eat lunch, to get back on the sewing machine, get back on the floor and sew. So I tried to follow prison rules and wrote a grievance and said, hey, we don't earn much, but you're not paying me for that extra time I'm working, because they said, nope, you get those 7 hours and that's it. I'm working 7.5 now. You've taken away half an hour. I want my, 11 cents, 11.5 cents. No,
It's real though.
no, wouldn't give it to us. That's slavery. And so while I was in prison, I realized what was happening. I had given it no thought previously. I had no interaction previously with law enforcement in any way, shape, or form. And I realized it wasn't right, and that a lot of people who are incarcerated, they're okay with it because they don't know that they're considered slaves. They don't know that they should be fighting for their rights and the rights of others who are incarcerated. Yes, we may have committed a crime, but we're there. Our punishment is being incarcerated, right? I should be able to make more than a couple dollars a day, if that. And so when I got out, I decided that I would work to continue to help and champion for people who are incarcerated, because they don't have a voice. There have been lawsuits about pay, and they've lost them all because we're considered slaves or indentured servants. We have no rights. And so I'm a part of the End Slavery in Minnesota campaign, and I'm working to help people who are incarcerated be classified as workers, because they work hard. I sewed military shorts. So for my 23 cents, there are people in the service who are wearing these $25 shorts. I didn't get that money. Federal government gets that money on our back. We ride it. And so once I was released, I decided that I needed to, like I said, continue working to help people who are incarcerated, and I want to help people who are also returning home. So I started Fed Exclusive Consulting, where I speak about hiring justice impacted people, because once we leave prison, a lot of times, if I learned how to sew in prison, where am I getting a job? I don't know how many sew factories you know around here that are hiring, but I haven't found one. So that's how I got here and why I'm a champion for this cause.
Thank you.
I said earlier, my name is Zeke Caligiuri. I'm before you now too, just because I'm fortunate to be home. I went away in 1999 and came home in 2022. I was a part of a homicide that I would say instantly understood the depths of what I had been a part of, and I think really had some serious intentions to figure out what that meant for my life, what it meant for who I would be able to be moving forward. And I too learned very quickly that these are not spaces that are built for accountability. They are not spaces that are built to confront those things about yourself. You can figure out ways to, but it is certainly not the way those places are run. They are run with specific purposes. They are run with an intentionality around control and maintaining this particular system. And part of that is this financial component. I had a wonderful set of parents that supported me throughout. Both of them passed away during my incarceration. Every living family member that I had passed away at some point during that 22 years. It's a lot to expect people to survive through. But one thing I knew and understood was that I was a human being. The other people who lived in these places were human beings as well. And we understood our humanity and we spoke about it and we were aware of that at all times. It's just not a stance that will be supported by the individual institutions. It's not a stance that will empower you within those places beyond, any of the sort of processes that they've created for you, whether that be work, whether that be, any sort of other programming. I worked for many years on the yard crew and in maintenance because I think maybe an element people don't always necessarily pay attention to is that throughout the history of prisons, the people who build those prisons are us. Like if you go back and you start looking at the walls, there were incarcerated workers that built all of them. We're part of the quarrying of that granite in St. Cloud that built that really majestic and dark wall. The same for the facility in Stillwater. We build them, and then we also are the ones that are tasked to repair them and keep them going. We build the machine that we are forced to live within. And it's a thing that you notice and understand pretty clearly without any sort of say involved in it too. Now I had some outlets and I was fortunate enough to meet some really wonderful human beings. I'm a writer, so we built a writing collective in there that was the first all prisoner run, all prisoner initiated writing collective in the country. Huge, right? Made a big deal, made a big difference for my life as I got prepared to come home. However, right, like that's not available for every single human being. You would like the idea of being able to create the thing that's going to free you. Not everybody is able to do that. And then what happened during this pandemic? I lived through the pandemic in this place. I was fortunate enough to be able to get out. The facilities had to sort of make these adjustments for the pandemic. And then on the back end of the pandemic, as we start to ease out and the rest of the world is starting to come back to each other, we did not. It stayed in a different kind of way. And as a result, we have what we have right now, whereas it's pretty much a crisis from day to day. And people are just trying to figure out how to, how they're going to make sense out of it. In a climate that's even more difficult than when I came through the door, right? And they've changed it. They've had life sentences are now life without parole. And so it's a very bleak environment. It's also really hard when you take away the small fragment of hope that people depend upon to add meaning to their lives. And we expect people to make better choices, yet they've been treated by the people that are responsible for them awful, right? In some cases, cruel and demeaning. And in a sense, too, you're not even then making any sort of money to support yourself. That's why I come here, because I think people don't necessarily understand exactly what it really is like to live within those places for such a long particular period of time, right? And I think if people did, you would understand why people are asking for something as substantial as this to be changed and sort of like to move into sort of a new world where people are at least compensated for their own labor.
My name is Tim Larice. I am born and raised in Minnesota, grew up in a working class house. To make a long story short, I ended up going to law school here in the Twin Cities. I went to the University of Minnesota with the specific goal of becoming an advocate for workers, enforcing workplace rights. And as I think there's law students in the room here, as many of you know, we're not always able to just choose the type of work we go into after law school. I got really lucky and I found a job at a firm that represents labor unions and workers as its fundamental mission. And I've been there ever since. I graduated law school in 2010. And so every day I advocate for workers. We represent labor unions in collective bargaining, in grievance processing, arbitration. We defend them when they get sued, anything that unions are involved in, with the fundamental idea that the workers that those unions represent are entitled to fairness, dignity, and respect in the workplace in every way that encompasses, not just wages, but health and safety, benefits, the things you need to live a balanced life, things that incarcerated workers do not have any access to. And that's, well, I'm here to provide a legal perspective on that side of things.
Cool. Thank you, guys. So I'm gonna read off the paper because I'm usually in the streets doing this, and I'll be like, bro, yeah, they freed us, but they didn't really free us. And that's kind of how I put it out there, because that's how, that's how folks talk to each other, right? Like, nah, they still got us in chains intentionally. That's how I'm usually throwing it out there. But I'm gonna read it word for word because we're in a room full of lawyers here. Keep it clear. Article 1, Section 2 of Minnesota's Constitution says, there will be no slavery or forced work in the state except as punishment for crime. So what does this mean legally, historically, and experientially to you guys? Like, when you read this, what does that make you feel?
I'll start with the legal side of things. So legally, what it means is that folks have the experiences that you just heard here. You can be incarcerated and forced to work. So the US Constitution, as we all know, prohibits slavery, but there's a few words tacked onto that says except for punishment for crime. The Minnesota State Constitution says the exact same thing. That really opens the door to all of us, to folks being incarcerated and then forced to work with no workplace protections at all. Forced to work without pay. They don't have access to the same health and safety laws that folks outside of prison have. And it's all completely legal, both the federal and state constitution in a nutshell.
And for me, it would just reinforce what I understood as an incarcerated person. And for many years, I never really thought about my rights or thought about a desire to reacquire them in a sense. We understand our outdate. We understand the things that you might be able to accomplish once you hit the door. But we also understand that that is there's shortcomings to that as well. And so it's not crazy to believe that people have to put some things into their back pocket and not necessarily worry about that. I mean, I spent 22.5 years in prison. That's a long time to wake up on any given day and expect that somehow that I should demand my rights back. There's a whole lot of conditioning. There's an institutionalization that occurs that is really harsh and dark. And being out here in the world now, I can look at and I can speak to it a little more with a little more clarity. But as an incarcerated person, you understand the conditions of your institutionalization at all times. I mean, so when I hear that, I hear it in the same way that we hear the Dred Scott decision around being less than a human being. You understand that in a sense, and if you've always lived with that too, that is something that you internalize and keep with you for, I would say probably the duration of your life. It's hard once you've been marginalized in a certain way to not necessarily feel marginalized throughout the course of your life.
For me, when I hear that, well, I had never thought about it. Most of us don't, right? Well, you guys are law students, a lot of you, so you probably do read the Constitution and the amendments, but I don't think the average person does. And so you don't think about it. So I never thought about it until I was incarcerated and forced to work. And so I started looking up, well, why? And so I started looking and I read that. And I was like, I'm a slave. Here it is, 2019, 18, and I'm a slave. I was shackled. I was transported in an inhumane way, handcuffed, forced to use the bathroom with one hand cuffed, one hand uncuffed, shackles on. I might not have been at the bottom of a boat, but I still was a transported slave from Ohio to Oklahoma to Texas and finally here to Minnesota. It's awful. I understand I committed a crime and I deserve to be punished, but I didn't deserve slavery.
What role does incarcerated labor play in the larger labor market? We're talking about Minnesota or your own personal experiences, but how does this impact the larger labor market? I guess I could give one of my examples I'm always giving is, because I'm sad about this and I always got to bring it up. I found out that Frosted Flakes is made by slave labor. That's the only cereal that I like. So I've been on boycott for a little over a year now, and I haven't had cereal. Now, I just want y'all to understand the sacrifice here, right? But there's so many other companies. There's so many other, and so I don't know if we have questions.
I have a question. I'm sorry, what do you mean? Like Post Brands or General Mills is using labor from the prisons to make Frosted Flakes?
Along with a lot of other companies, Cargill is probably one of the most clear ones because it actually is on an old plantation where they then did convict leasing and they've expanded the prison now. So it was at one time literally slave labor, right? And now they're still working the fields for their products. So that's one of the bigger companies that you can see very clearly. Like it just shifted. They put convict leasing on the land, started bringing in prisons, made more money, expanded their prison, turned it into an industrial company, and boom, there it is. But yes, there's a lot, but I don't know, maybe you guys could speak to some more of that.
Oh, yeah, go
No, I was gonna say,
ahead.
well, I served my time at, down at Wasika, being federal, we did not deal with a lot of companies like as I said, I was making shorts for the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Army. But I also know that, you know, there are people who, unfortunately, my uncle was incarcerated. He said, I used to make ceiling mattresses. Yeah. Ceiling mattresses. He's like, you buy those for thousands of dollars. And he said, I was making 12 cents. I said, nothing's changed, Uncle Jerome. He's 70. Nothing's changed. He's still making what people are making today. And there are a lot of companies that take advantage of the prison system to create their products. And not just products, but also services. There are companies that use incarcerated folks to handle telephone calls for cable and other services. So when you're calling about your cell phone not working, you might be talking to somebody who's incarcerated and you have no clue. You think you're just talking to Jenna. Well, Jenna's sitting in a cell at night, but she's helping you during the day.
Well, and along those same lines too, in Minnesota, they have used all sorts of different, or had all sorts of contracts. The biggest one I would say that stands out is Anagram. Now, Anagram makes Mylar balloons. So if any of you have had birthday parties or anything along those lines and somebody brought you a Mylar balloon, there's a pretty good chance that it was packaged by an incarcerated person in the state of Minnesota. They have had industry in other states, but their primary contract was here. They took it from a group of special needs folks that used to do this job and brought it inside the prisons and do interstate work with that. And it's probably one of the most heavily sought after positions in the facility because there's an opportunity to make a little bit more money beyond that. They call them interstate wages, but it's hours and hours of packaging different size balloons, different theme balloons. I mean, anything that you thought of, that you could think of, whether it was Charlie Brown or the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they are on these balloons that incarcerated people are folding. Sometimes overnight. Every single facility in the state has with the exclusion of Lino Lakes because they have treatment base, but the majority of the facilities in the state facilities have contracts and have industry that are building or that are packaging balloons. If you are a state-based company, a state agency, and you are ordering furniture for your offices, it's going to go through MinCor, Minnesota Corporation, which is essentially it was created by people that had worked in the prison system, former wardens, associate wardens. It was created in the 90s to really cash in on some of the things that privately funded prisons had pretty much learned how to exploit. And they were like, we need to make sure that some of these contracts don't leave. And so they built this company, and it was not profitable for many years, and it probably still was not. Even the state of Minnesota had to tell them, either figure out and show us where you where this is a viable corporation and not just a money grab to create positions and put people into money spaces, but it's really not a successful business. And what they did then instead was then they gave MinCor this contract as the centralized canteen. So anything that we purchase with the money that we make or have sent into stays in the same cycle of money too. They have a laundry contract, which essentially forces incarcerated people to swap their linen out through the same corporation every week for the duration of their incarceration. And both of those contracts were really meant just in general to throw a bone to MinCor so it would stay in business. But they are also the ones that run the garment industry in a similar fashion that you do in the feds. And then also they do the upholstery. And so they are required to go through MinCor first. If you are a state agency, they want you to examine the other state opportunities or options for purchase before you go outside of that too. And so the likelihood is that a lot of us have probably been sitting on office furniture that came and were built at the hands of the people that we know, the people we spent time with. Yeah.
For sure. And so I told you I'm on the school board, and I ran on ending the school to prison pipeline. And so one of the first things, order of business, as I got sworn in on the situation, was to investigate where our procurement was coming from for our furniture. And because they knew I was running and it looked like a good chance I was going to win, they had canceled the contract in November with this company, and also shifted because this is what else is crazy. Teachers' pensions are also invested in privatized prisons across the nation. This is normal. And it's mostly because it's the most profitable business you can get into, because guess what? Free labor is profitable, right? And so they had withdrawn their investments in that because they knew I was coming. But they are most districts are invested in privatized prisons. And the direct link to that is, one, the furniture. So think about that cycle, right? Taxpayers pay money, the district pays for this furniture at market rate. You know what I mean? And then we got prison labor that's making 12 cents an hour or 25 cents an hour to make it. You know what I mean? It's a nasty cycle with our tax dollar, honestly. And then I was talking about the pensions. It slipped. It's okay, because I have a question. But either way, the teachers' pensions are, I'm gonna tell you why. Because for a long time they were giving the MCA test scores, third grade test scores, to the Department of Corrections. So the Department of Corrections could start to prepare beds for those children in the upcoming years, knowing that a percentage of the children that couldn't read in the third grade were most likely going to end up in their prison systems. And so if you think about it, a lot of teachers didn't know that their pensions were invested in this, but think about teachers that might have. And how they could think about, like, wait a minute, my investment, because I'm going to retire in 15 years, and this class is going to be, and I know the stats, and I could play these games, right? I don't know if that ever actually happened, but I do know that our MCA scores for Black and brown children are extremely low in the state of Minnesota. And when I say extremely, I mean like, it's bad. I don't even want to tell you. I'm a school board member. I don't even want to tell you. Find it for yourself. No, I'm just kidding. I'm working on it in my district. Okay, so I have a question. I have another question. How do low wages in prison affect the families and the folks on the outside? How does that impact that?
So I know for me, earning that big whopping 23 cents an hour, and that was for what the federal government created called Unicor. Now, as I said, I had never been involved with prison, police, or anything. So initially, I thought people said they were telling me to go get a job with Unicor. And so I was like, yeah, I'm gonna get a job with Unicor. They said that's where you make your money. Yeah. And so I got to Wasika and I was like, I want to work for that unicorn. And they were like, you mean unicorn? I'm like, yeah. I was like, I thought it was a unicorn. But yeah, I'll work for them too. That's where the good money is at, right? And they were like, yeah, it is. I was like, well, how much I'm gonna make? And they said 23 cents starting off. Oh, 23 cents?
Good money.
They were like, well, you can, if you work hard enough, you can get it all the way up to like $1.26. I said, $1.26? Okay. So what am I gonna do? I never made it that high, thank goodness, because I wasn't there that long. But with 23 cents an hour, I couldn't do anything. I robbed banks. I had to pay back restitution, right? So they're taking half my whatever I made, which wasn't much. So I'm getting a check every month, maybe for 40 bucks. That's nothing to survive. They don't give you get a pair of boots, not a pair of gym shoes, not a pair of casual shoes. That's all they give you when you get there. So I had to buy myself some shoes. You get green uniforms, no shorts, no t-shirts, no good underwear, no bras that fit. So you have to buy all this stuff. Can I buy all that for 23 cents an hour? Absolutely not. So my family, every month, they're sending me money. Not for me to go out and play and buy a whole bunch of food or buy, there's MP3 player you could buy and you could download music and buy that. I didn't get any of that stuff. I just wanted the basics. And my family had to send in money, take money out of their pockets to ensure that I could have a pair of gym shoes so I wasn't running around on the rec yard in boots in the middle of summer. And so the impact, it goes to them. I didn't want to call and say, hey, can you put a couple bucks on my books so I could buy some commissary, so I could buy a bag of rice or a little packet of chicken for $5? You know how long it would take me to earn $5 to buy one little bag of chicken? Too long. And so I know individually the financial part hit my family. I was sort of lucky because it was during COVID, and at that time, the federal government said, okay, well, since you guys are locked in and you can't have visitors or anything, we're going to give you free telephone calls. So I was lucky to get free telephone calls. If I hadn't, every 15-minute call would have been $3.15. Every 15-minute call. I talk to my family every day, 2 times a day. So imagine if they would have had to pay that too. And there were people, and there are people today who are paying that to talk to their family, even though you and I all know it only costs cents to make a telephone call, right? Cents. But they're making big money off of the backs of people who are incarcerated.
And those are really good points. It's pressure that gets put on your family. Family want to support and love their people. They all work too. We understand the pressures. I mean, how expensive are groceries these days? They are carrying that while also then carrying us. And in some cases, they're not able to. And then once we've hit this point where they're not able to, but they've wanted to, oftentimes you will see a disconnect between families and their incarcerated loved ones. There's a lot of shame that is bound up in poverty. It's bound up in not being able to care for our people as properly as we should, right? And on the other end too, there is a shame about asking our families who they didn't commit the harms that I did. They want to love you. It's a very difficult thing, and you see this a lot. And also, you see people. Then you're putting people in a spot where money is not easily accessed, and so if you get into one of those runs where you lose your job because you went to segregation or another, something that you had to do that was based around like the culture, things happen often. Then you would end up going through this big long hiatus without any money coming in.
Mm.
And how do you expect people to survive in that point too? And oftentimes they go into a more cannibal nature and start to figure out ways to get it from other incarcerated people. Like I said, they've modeled a way of behavior, a way of treatment for other people for us. The system has modeled it for us, and as a result, like it's a very easy pathway to fall down in this idea of the way we have to get something for ourselves, right? We are just dealing with scarcity, which is capitalism, which is what we know, but at a point where it's much more controlled and it is much more scrutinized in a sense that makes it much harder. I mean, you could never tell me. I mean, when my father passed away, 2011, I could wear that. I understood it. I understood that I would have been incarcerated for that period of time. The things that I did, I could wear that and understand that I had created the scenario that I could lose my father in. But when I lost my mother in 2017, I had completely pivoted to a point where I believed I would come home and that we would have a reunion, and that the sacrifices she made for all those years would come to fruition with this moment. And she didn't. She passed. And so it's very, it's not hard for me to place the blame at the feet of these people who did. They ratcheted up the pressure at every particular point. And so like what we're looking at is that like money is hard for people, not just people that are incarcerated. And so the connectivity between those, you're going to have the tension at the points in which those two factions need to interact.
I would just add a couple of points.
Can I ask you a different question? I know you want to add a couple points, but I want to get a
Yeah.
little more. I have a specific question for you right
Great.
quick. What's the path towards instating equitable workers' rights for incarcerated folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been a bit of a movement around the country to amend state constitutions that allow for incarcerated workers to essentially be forced to work as slaves. And I think there are eight states now that have done that have successfully passed constitutional amendments at the state level to change the type of language that we have here in Minnesota, saying that essentially slavery is allowed as punishment for a crime. So that's good. And there are lots of reasons why that is a step in the right direction for the rights of incarcerated workers. The problem, though, is that just changing the Constitution, the language that prohibits slavery isn't enough. You also need legislation that ensures that incarcerated workers have the same rights to fair wages, health and safety that everyone else has. That only comes about through legislation. And so far, to my knowledge, David, correct me if I'm wrong, none of the states that have amended their constitutions have adopted legislation that has affected any sort of meaningful change, unfortunately. So the question, what is it going to take? That's really what it takes at a fundamental level, is legislative change to have the statutes amended to classify incarcerated workers as employees for purposes of minimum wage, health and safety, family medical leave, all the things that workers in the private and public sector sort of take for granted. The other thing I would add, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the commissioner of the Department of Corrections actually has statutory authority by himself to determine what incarcerated workers are paid. So there is a person in this state right now who could, with the stroke of a pen, make it so that incarcerated workers make a fair and living wage. So this policy of, a quarter an hour, if you're lucky, $2 an hour, That's not written in stone anywhere. That's just the policy of the state. So I think that's important to understand.
Because
as well.
they've changed it several times. It just hasn't been changed since 1990.
Are they elected?
It is it's a governor appointed position. Yeah. The other thing I would want to just mention, so there was an ACLU report, I think from a couple years ago, that found that incarcerated workers produce $2 billion worth of products every year and $9 billion worth of services. So they're a significant market player. And the other thing I wanted to mention, so Zeke mentioned interstate wages. There are certain jobs where incarcerated workers can make really significantly more money than 25 cents an hour. I think some jobs pay like $10 an hour, which, is still not life-changing amounts of money, but in the incarcerated
Except they don't have access to it. So what happens is you get it's usually a minimum wage, at least in Minnesota, this is the way it's done, and maybe others. But it allows the space to get paid. You get paid the minimum wage. However, you'll never make more than whatever the dollar slot is that you're at. It may be $2. I think there is a $2.65 slot. There's usually one in each shop. That's like the top of it. The rest of that money can go towards the payment of restitution. If you don't have restitution, that money just goes to the facility and to the department. Correct?
Yeah, so they still deduct most of it away. But there is a federal law called the Asher-Sumner's Act that says that if workers are creating products to be sold in interstate commerce, they have to be paid prevailing wages, like wages that are comparable to other workers in the market. And so there is a federal law that says, in certain circumstances, incarcerated workers should be paid more. There's a couple of problems with that, as Zeke pointed out. There's still enormous deductions. So like the pay that the worker actually gets on the check at the end of the day is minuscule compared to the rate that the law requires. The other problem is if the prison doesn't follow the law and pay the wages, and there's been litigation on this, courts have said the worker has no right of action. The worker cannot sue for the wages that they are entitled to under federal law. Because courts have found that law, the Asher-Sumner Act, was not intended to benefit them. And there's nothing in the law that says they have a right to go to court of unpaid wages.
Who was it intended to?
The law was intended, according to the courts, the law was intended to benefit society generally, not the workers who are entitled. So the case, if you want to read about it, is called McMaster versus State of Minnesota. It's actually a Minnesota case.
Sounds a lot like Dred Scott to me.
Yeah, I mean, the court, a very brave lawyer brought this case in the early 90s. And one of the claims that they made was that incarcerated workers in Minnesota should be considered employees for purposes of minimum wage under federal wage law. And the court said that is not the case. Incarcerated workers are not employees in the legal sense. They are involuntary servants of the state. And so because that's their classification, they were entitled to none of the protections of those laws. So it's sort of a landmark case in this area that's sort of echoed since the 90s. That's where that comes from.
Really, it becomes MinCorp. MinCorp is brokering the labor of the people that are working in the interstate job. So it's their contract with Anagram. Therefore, they are dictating whatever the terms are that are in that contract.
After this, Google MinCorp, MINNCOR. You can go to their state-run website and see their product line. All the things that is created by incarcerated workers, and you'll probably recognize some of the furniture and the other things that they produce. But they actually have a website set up where they're advertising the products made by incarcerated workers here in Minnesota for pennies.
So what do you guys think are some of the pushbacks for reclassifying incarcerated workers?
Comes down to, money.
Yeah.
What company right now wants to lose money? There's not a company or organization that's saying, well, I want to make less. I want to reduce my profit from 10% down to 2% to give people who are incarcerated more money. Who's saying that? Who's raising their hand to say, I want to be a part of that? And then there's right now, the United States is in a punishment phase. As we know, things are secular. And at times, people who are incarcerated, they talk about rehabilitation and they want to work to help people and rehabilitate. But right now, we're in a punishment phase. And so there's society at large that might not feel the way we do, that people shouldn't be classified as slaves or treated like slaves while they're incarcerated.
Yeah, and I agree with it. It is certainly money. It's also just a general idea around the idea of punishment. The whole sort of language around being correctional facilities has been BS from the beginning. While we have gone through different phases where it has revealed itself and shown itself at different times in our history where certain opportunities were made available. At the most basic level, right? It is a whole lot easier to push something that you are trying to push if you can continue to move this sort of train of fear throughout. It's this idea that like we are going to give something to somebody that doesn't deserve something. But the language in the Constitution is what has allowed folks to be able to determine who's human and who is not. I think the biggest thing is companies, corporations, they push back against union work all the time, unionized work all the time. I mean, this is what they do. You have to force them to do things. You have to force the Department of Corrections to do things too, and that comes through legislation. It does come through legal means. And that can be very daunting and doesn't necessarily come every day. However, right? However, I feel like what would need to happen is you need these corporations on the side of saying we will invest in these things if we can get in there. We could, and I still feel like we would still be in an era of exploitation. There would still be these discrepancies and disparities. However, you would have situations where people were able to save enough money to be able to take care of themselves when they get older. One thing we're not recognizing is that there's no pensions coming out of incarceration. And so, I mean, I came out at 44 years old. I feel young in a lot of ways, but I also know how far I am behind towards the idea of retirement, towards the idea of being comfortable and creating the living wage that I need to be able to raise my child.
I want to thank everyone for coming out today on the panel and thank all of you guys for coming out. I want to shout out David Banky for all of the work that he's done leading up to this spot. He's been doing so much work around incarceration, which has gotten us here. He's right there. He gave a little. And then I just want to say that folks can be around to ask questions afterwards so you can make direct connections, because I think, getting involved is really important. You can also hit this little QR code and you can join in and get involved. We've got a few things happening. We've got the May Day on the Hill, and then we also have a gala on May 17th. Please join, please sign the petition. There's a petition to end slavery and get involved. I mean, the reality is that during Reconstruction, people were stuck. How are we going to do this? How are we going to end slavery and continue to make our pockets fat, right? That was the question. And this is the thing that they chose. So now we're here.